All right, well, hey, listen, everybody, thanks for coming. Really appreciate you all joining us here. As those of you who might be watching this by video can tell, we're doing our USADA CEO message, which we do once a quarter, once a month, just depending on the news that's going on. We decided to do a little bit different today. We've got some people from the staff who were kind enough to come in and hopefully ask some questions near the end of this, but we thought we would take some time to talk about the TMZ China positive tests and how they were handled, and really dive into some of the facts. We're going to also, for this discussion, have sections. So if you're watching on TV by video, whether you're an elite level athlete that this will go out to, or you're someone, maybe in a sport organization, or maybe you sit at the WADA governing boards or a government organization that deals with anti-doping, the idea is that you can fast forward, you can watch continuously if you hope to or need to, but you can also split it up and come back to it as your time permits. But given that so much has been written about this topic, the Chinese 23 TMZ positive tests, literally we went and counted all the words from the various press conferences and the statements that WADA has put out, and it's over 40,000 words. And if you're curious, that translates into somewhere between 160 and 200 pages. The problem is many of the questions that we began initially asking when this news first broke, we just simply don't have answers to. And that's exactly why we wanted to try to do this forum, so that people could remember what those questions are and continue our best to try to get answers to those questions. Let me just say that we've asked also WADA to sit down with us. Unfortunately, they've refused to do that. And I think, as many of you have seen from the press statements, when we began asking questions, when the initial reports were publicized by the various media departments and outlets, WADA went on the attack. And part of their strategy, I think, was intentionally to deflect away from answering some of the basic questions and try to shift the mudslinging, so to speak, onto those who were asking the questions. Sometimes to us at USADA and us personally, sometimes other organizations. Of course, we're going to defend our honor and our duty and our integrity and what we are here to do on behalf of clean athletes. And so you see some of this back and forth from a press standpoint. And really that has just gotten in the way of getting to the bottom of what actually happened in these cases, and how can we answer the questions that we're having from clean athletes here, both in the United States, but also around the world. So a few things we're going to go through. Number one, why do we care? Number two, what do we know at this point? Number three, what do the rules say? Number four, what does the science say? Number five, what does the investigation say? And then lastly, we're going to talk a little bit about where we are now and where do we go from here, and really what do clean athletes need, and what does the public need to move on from this situation. So why do we care? I think number one, you have to look at the World Anti-Doping Code. It's the set of rules that apply to all of us around the world, those who participate in the Olympic movement. And you see in the writing and the preamble of what the code is all about is this idea that the code is here to promote free sport and thus promote health, fairness, and equality. And we really believe here at USADA that one of the biggest injustices that can happen to an athlete is for them to be robbed by another athlete who is not playing by the rules. And it's this set of rules that sets that framework for those athletes to compete the right way and gives them hope that their sacrifice, their hard work is actually going to be rewarded when they show up at an international competition or a national competition where these rules apply. And let me just make one point, and you've heard other athletes talk about this. For those maybe who are watching this that aren't in the registered testing pool, of course our staff is fully aware of this. It is awfully difficult to live successfully as a clean athlete in the anti-doping program. Just think about it for a second. And if you're not familiar with it, it might shock you what our athletes have to go through in order to live successfully in the anti-doping system. They have to literally give us their whereabouts, their location, 365 days a year so that they can be located for testing. If you decide, hey, I'm going to sleep in this morning, I don't feel like going to the track or the swimming pool, whatever area you're going to train at 8 o'clock. You want to sleep in and go at 9. Well, before you fall back asleep, you better make sure you change your whereabouts. It's pretty incredible. I'm not sure any other industry has people other than maybe parolees or people that have been convicted of crimes, literally, maybe airplane pilots, maybe railroad car drivers who are tested, but it's an incredible system that athletes have to abide by. And then think about what happens when they do show up and test you. A stranger literally knocks on your door at 6 a.m. in the morning, potentially, or maybe at 10 o'clock at night, after your kids have already gone to bed and you're trying to go to sleep yourself. Imagine a loud pounding on your door or a doorbell ringing at that time of the night, and a stranger is there to collect a sample. And what happens when they collect the sample? I mean, again, we all know here in the room, you literally have to pull down your pants and show your genitals in front of a stranger and provide a sample in a cup. Holy cow. What we're asking of athletes. And if it's not a urine sample, then they get a needle. And they stick a needle in your vein and take your blood in order to ship it off to the laboratory. This is what we're expecting of our elite level athletes. It's actually pretty incredible that they're willing to do this. We could talk about whether they have a choice and the leverage to have it done in the way that it's done, but the fact is, this is the life they have to live. And not only that, they have to worry about things they take, their medications, any vitamins or minerals or potential supplements. It is an incredibly difficult life to have to live. And what our athletes tell us resoundingly is, yes, this is the rules, and yes, we're willing to do this. It's crazy to think that we have to do this, but it's way less inconvenient, it's way less intrusive than going to a major national competition or a major international competition like the Olympic Games and getting robbed by someone who is not abiding and playing by those same rules. And they want consistency in the application of the rules and ensure that around the world, every athlete is held to the same rules that they're held to. And this strenuous system, that's the least that we can do. So we care on behalf of those athletes that are held to those standards, and there are many around the world that are held to those standards. But athletes themselves care. Here you see a picture from Adam Peaty, a UK swimmer, one of the top swimmers in the world out of England, and you see him. He cares because it's fraud on the people he competes against if someone is cheating him. And it's also fraud on the public for those who are watching him. Here, someone, Olympic swimmer from Australia, many of you know the name, Zach Cook. Similarly, it's incredibly disappointing to know that other athletes haven't been held to the same rules and the same process that's required on all athletes. And of course, in this particular case, the TMZ cases, athletes are asking the questions. This was at a press conference in Paris when one of the top swimmers said, "We have not had the answers answered that we need, the questions answered that we need answered. We need to hear." So what do we know? Well, we know because the media exposed it, not because the rules were followed that otherwise should have reported it, but the media in April of this year, 2024, disclosed that there were actually 28 positive tests on 23 swimming athletes, elite of the elite from China, from an event January 1 to January 3 of 2021. And I mentioned there are 28 positive tests, and that's going to be important a little bit later in the conversation because some athletes had multiple tests and multiple positive tests. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. The positive tests were for a prohibited drug under the World Anti-Doping Agency's rules, the prohibited list. You can look at the prohibited list yourself and see it. It's called trimetazidine, or what's known as TMZ, and I'm just going to use it as TMZ for purposes of this conversation. But really importantly, TMZ is tested for and is prohibited in competition, so at the event itself, as well as all times, so outside of the event itself. And there's a particular reason for that, because TMZ is, one, it was a controlled substance only available by prescription, does not come in food, does not show up in kitchens without a reason. It was originally developed as an angina drug. It helps your cardiac function. Well, we also know, and the reason it's prohibited out of competition is because it helps reduce fatigue and it gives your cardiac efficiency when you're training. So the recovery and the training that you would experience if you're using this would be enhanced. So while it may not, and you're going to hear a little bit later that WADA has really focused on that it didn't have performance enhancing benefits at low levels during the competition. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. What question we've asked, what about the benefits if it was intentionally used prior to the competition? If you can train harder and longer, if you can recover faster and more efficiently, that's an ideal drug to use when you're training. And that is why it's prohibited all the time. It's also why the default sanction for it is 4 years. It's the highest maximum level of 4 years for an offense for it. So what do the rules say? Very quickly, the WADA code, again, that document that I put up at the very beginning is the rules we're talking about. And you can find it, there's booklets floating around, you can go on the internet and look at the rules yourself. I've made some cites to the rules that I would hope you would go and check. But the WADA rules have what's known as strict liability. A lot of people, strict liability in most countries is basically what happens when you get pulled over for speeding. And the idea is you would never be able to prove someone knowingly or intentionally broke the speed limit, because when the officer came to your door to give you a ticket, you would just say, oh, I didn't know I was going over the speed limit. And that intent to speed would never be able to be proven. And so what you see in the anti-doping landscape is the exact same idea of what's known as strict liability. And what it means is when you have a positive test, the burden to prove that you didn't intend to do it shifts to you. We assume intent. And so again, we're talking TMZ, and here's just a small graph to demonstrate this. Article 2.1 of the WADA code assumes that you intentionally did and used for performance enhancing purposes if you have a positive drug test for, in this case, TMZ. That's all that is needed. And once that is demonstrated, there's an automatic provisional suspension for TMZ. And just a small note here, because there's been a lot of conversation around provisional suspensions. You can see Article 7.4 from the WADA code is cited. This drug, again, because of its powerful performance enhancement, both in competition and out of competition, it requires a mandatory provisional suspension. Some drugs, there is not a mandatory. And the idea there is, if you're going to get a lasting benefit from a particular drug, you want the person immediately off the playing field. If the drug is not going to give you a lasting benefit, then it's okay if they compete a few weeks later until the case is resolved. The way in a TMZ case, a positive for TMZ, that you can undo the provisional suspension is by going to a hearing. And the athlete has to demonstrate a contaminated product. There is an exception. At a hearing, in front of an independent hearing officer, the athlete has to demonstrate that a contaminated product, and look, the contaminated product has a definition, and it is a product that has a label that the athlete couldn't identify had the substance in it. It doesn't apply on its face. Please read the rule. It doesn't apply to environmental contamination or food contamination or a drug showing up in a kitchen magically. It just simply doesn't apply. And worse here, what we now know is that the Chinese athletes weren't even notified of the positive tests. They didn't know about the positive tests. So they had no way to appeal the provisional suspension. And look, it's a minor point, but if those athletes would have been provisionally suspended as the rules required, they would have, at a minimum, been out of competition until June of 2021, when China, the Chinese anti-doping agency, resolved the cases. They would have missed their Olympic trials. Other athletes who should have gotten the benefit of those rules would have been at those Olympic trials, made the Olympic team, So there were Chinese athletes that got disadvantaged by the rules that require all to be applied in every case were not applied. Number 3, there's an automatic violation. There is no such thing as no violation in the WADA code once you have an adverse analytical finding, a positive test for TMZ. It cannot just simply go away. That's Article 1. Article 9, automatic disqualification from the event at which you test positive. It's automatic. There is no discretion. It's unauthorized. It's illegal under the rules to say that you're not going to disqualify. And again, I think we have to care about those Chinese athletes who lost their placement at the event January 1 through January 3. They should have been increased in the standings. They should have gotten the money that went along with their victories, because the people in front of them that had the positive test absolutely under the rules should have been disqualified. And those athletes got taken advantage of when the rules weren't applied fairly and evenly. How much money? I don't know. Was it points? Think of the confidence you gain when you win an event, bringing home a trophy to your parents. How nice would that have been? No, it was absolutely taken away from those athletes. There's also a default sanction of 4 years. And again, Article 10.2 of the WADA Code. Public announcement, automatic in a case. You can look at Article 14.3. So that is strict liability, what happens. The only time that there's a difference in that outcome is when the athlete proves, that first section, proves that the positive test was due to no significant fault or no fault of their own. So again, the burden shifts to the athlete. The athlete under the rules has to prove it. And if they can prove no significant fault or no fault in how the violation occurred, then they can get a reduction, which we'll talk about in just a second. Very importantly, in order to prove no significant fault or no fault, the athlete has to prove the source of the positive test. So they have to demonstrate where the positive came from, basically. And in addition to that, and that's in the rules, that's in the definition of no fault or no significant fault in the WADA code. There's a whole definition section you can go and look at the actual definitions of it. And this is common practice for those of us in anti-doping. Everyone knows these rules that handles these cases as we move cases forward. The second point is you also have to prove causation, meaning that the source that you proved caused the positive test actually then caused the level of the finding, that it correlates to the level of the finding in your sample. Now, there is a little bit of a debate. Some lawyers, some CAS panels say causation, yeah, you don't really have to prove it. But recent case, and certainly WADA's position, is that you have to prove that causation. So there's really two elements that you have to prove moving forward. But let me make one last point. Even if you prove that, the only thing that changes is this 4-year sanction can go down to 0 sanction. Could be 1 year, could be 2 years, but it can be reduced if you prove no significant fault, the source and the contamination. However, the automatic violation remains, the disqualification remains, and the public announcement remains. And even if you believe there was no fault, which is what WADA has said, and even if you believe they proved the source and that they proved causation, you still have a public announcement, a disqualification, and a violation. And that was not done. China didn't do it, and WADA allowed China not to do it. So what does the science say? Is it contamination? Is it a no-fault case? WADA has said it's a no-fault case. And here's a statement from WADA that they ran, and they've said different variations of this same comment, which is basically compelling scientific evidence pointed exclusively to the fact that this was a case of no-fault contamination. So WADA is saying, in their view, the facts that they saw proved that prior slide that I showed, that this was a no-fault contamination case. They've had different variations, but that's basically the point, that all you have to look at is the science to determine that this was a no-fault contamination case. So let's take a little bit of a look at the science. You see while not necessarily in their press comments, when the US Congress did ask for very poignant information about this contamination theory and why WADA thought and believed it was a contamination no-fault case, WADA's lawyers responded, and you can go and look at the letter, and they basically had a few points of why, from a scientific standpoint, they believe this was a no-fault contamination case. Number one, swimmers tested positive at the same time at low levels. Okay, so swimmers tested positive at the same time at low levels. Look, we handled the Lance Armstrong case, the US Postal Service's case, and there were teams that used drugs together. They stayed at the same hotels and did blood transfusions in the hotels. That's not really a fact that weighs towards contamination or not, but it's one of the facts they indicated. They also said there was no performance enhancing benefit at the competition. And really importantly, the nuance that I think they're trying to draw here is that at low levels, at the event, maybe that competition itself that day was not impacted by the low levels. However, as we previously discussed, the training benefits, the recovery benefits, if you can be rested and refreshed and more efficient recovery coming into an event, and you are able to train harder before that event, well, of course that's going to transfer over to the event and give you a performance advantage during that event. And again, it's why the substance is prohibited all the time. If it didn't give you that advantage, then it only should be prohibited in competition. And we're talking about a wholly different thing here if that's the case, but that's not the case. So number two, variations in results. They use the word tend to rule out deliberate ingestion. Ingestion. So the language is slightly different. It tends to, not exclusively like we heard previously on the slide, but it tends to. And what they're talking about here, and I'm going to dive into this a little bit because it's the main thrust, I think, of their scientific position, which is the athletes had, I mentioned there were 28 positives, some had multiple. Well, you see some of the athletes had a negative positive. So on one day of the event, they had a negative sample. The next day, they had a positive sample. Some had positive, negative, positive. And then there was some that had a negative, negative, positive. And WADA's position is, let's just take the negative, positive. So negative, meaning they hadn't used it, they hadn't been exposed to it. And then the next day when they're tested, actually they were positive for it. That's the thrust of what their scientific argument is. And we're going to talk a little bit about that in a second. What is now number three, swimmers from different regions of China had different coaches. Again, if that fact is true, it really has no bearing on the science. And what's been reported just in the last month or so is that there are serious questions if in fact that's true. What's actually been reported by media that whistleblowers have brought to media is that in fact, no, the swimmers were together most of the time training prior to this event. The fourth, same place at the same time when the positives happened, kind of addressed that a little bit already. And then 3 other swimmers at a different hotel tested negative. Again, not scientific, but facts that help, lend in their mind. But again, we don't know how many swimmers at this hotel tested negative, which is a fact that's worth considering as well if you're going to consider how many at other hotels. But you also, as the Lance Armstrong example indicated, you stay together, sometimes you dope together. You don't stay together, maybe you're not doping together. Again, is it definitive of contamination, no fault? I think not, but that's what WADA has indicated. So to dive a little bit into the 2 elements of the science, this is an excretion graph, and I'm going to focus on their position about variations at this point. And what you have here, this is days, okay? So let's say you take a drug and you see that drug, this is the concentration of the prohibited substance, that drug goes up in your body, and if you were to provide a sample, it would be high. And then over time, it eventually leaves your body. Certain drugs can stay in your body for many days, many weeks, many months. Some depends on how much you take, how long you've been using. There are other drugs, and think about if you take an Advil, right, which is not prohibited. But if you take an Advil, the doctor will tell you, take some 3 or 4 hours later because it wears off. And as it wears off, it's also going to leave your system. That's the nature of that type of drug. There is also what's known as a limit of detection. So we understand what's been reported as the limit of detection for TMZ is about 100 picograms. And so that's the level which below that level, the lab cannot detect it. It very well could be in your urine. You just can't detect it. So when you use the term negative, yes, technically it's declared negative, but that drug could still be in your urine just below what the lab is able to detect. Well, WADA talks about, again, the variations. And we talked about that negative, positive, negative, or positive, negative, positive. This is what they're talking about, which is, and we've just made this graph, you see at low ends of the excretion curve, near the level of detection, you very well may see above the level of detection, the next one below, the next one above. This is a common phenomenon in anti-doping science. We know this. There are many drugs that this happens with. You can look at the M3 of oral turinabol. You can look at clomiphene. You can look at ostarine or any of the SARMs. It is a known phenomenon because the urine will have different parts to it that can help or deter your ability to detect it at or below the level of detection. And so it's perfectly normal sometimes that you have these fluctuations and these variations. And here's a couple reasons for these variations. One is specific gravity. We've asked for the data on these samples. WADA could put the data out there if they chose to. They've made statements that the specific gravity in most of the cases was normal, but we don't know. And we also don't know what were the characteristics of the sample. And for the athletes at home, you know specific gravity is important because we do subsequent samples. You may have to stay longer to testing because we get another sample because it's based on the specific gravity to make sure we get a sample that can be identified and that we need more urine if it's dilute and not concentrated enough. There's other issues, bacterial degradation. What's interesting in this case is these samples it took 2 months roughly, and I think what WADA and China have indicated is that was due to COVID restrictions, and hopefully they froze them during that time period because that helps the stability and avoids some degradation, but we don't know how much degradation, and the point here is the sample can fluctuate in its values based on the sample storage and possible degradation. And of course, there's exercise, and then I just mentioned the stability if you're freezing or not freezing the sample. All right, so that's the main thrust of their argument on the variation. And scientists who have seen this, and I'm not a scientist, clearly, I've consulted with our science team. We've talked to others who have seen the science put out by WADA, and this is the best case for WADA on the variation. And it's not very strong, I don't think, and it's not very powerful whatsoever. Certainly doesn't prove exclusively contamination. It's just as consistent with intentional use. And we know other substances, this fluctuation happens after intentional use at low levels. So shift your mind slightly to look at this from a different perspective. Now we want to look at, are these numbers consistent with intentional use? And there's not a ton out there that we've seen, and WADA hasn't put much out there on the rate at which, if you take TMZ intentionally, the rate at which it leaves your body. The best place to go is the figure skater, who, by the way, got 4 years for a low level. I think her level is like 2.1 nanograms, where we understand these Chinese cases are 1.5, 1.7 and below, best we can tell from some of the reports. We've again asked for those specific numbers as well, which would be helpful to see. So we don't know. But here in Valieva, you see that WADA was relying to the panel on information provided by the manufacturer TMZ. And they've said in these Chinese cases that they got confidential information from the manufacturer that helped them with their determination that this was a no-fault contamination case. So if you look at, this is again verbatim from the Valieva case, what they say is if an athlete uses 7.5 milligrams to 35 milligrams, okay, that the concentration would end up being 1 nanogram to 1.7 nanograms per milliliter after 4 or 5 days. Does that make sense? So if you take it today, 4 or 5 days later from now, it's going to be at, the sample in your urine is going to be 1 to 1.7 nanograms. So you got like a 5-day window to use it. They also say for lower doses, okay, same 1 to 1.7 nanograms per milliliter would be reached after 3 days. So one of the things we've asked for, we've asked WADA, we've asked CHINATA, we've asked World Aquatics. They've put out a lot of information about all the tests that the Chinese athletes were doing. Well, let's see what the testing in December was. And we know from the ARD report, the German documentary that was one of the initial that broke this, that they claim there was less testing in the month of December on these athletes. And it would be great to know, were there any tests on these athletes 2 weeks before this event, a week before this event, 5 days before this event, 3 days before this event? Because if the Chinese samples were at, let's say 1.5, 1.6, and what the amount was in their samples, well, that's exactly identical to if they would have used this level dose 3 days before. So the questions around the intentional use are alive and well, and athletes deserve to know. Here's just that put, on a dosage. 5 days, that dose, according to the Valieva panel, based on WADA science, including the TMZ manufacturing data, is that after 5 days, you'd be down to 1 to 1.7, which is, right at the tail end of that excretion. Here's the 0.5, 7.5 dose. Again, level of detection down to that level. So a lot of people are familiar that WADA set up self-appointed, drafted the terms of reference from the staffers who made the decision not to appeal these cases, which we didn't think was the best way to do it. It should have been done by the executive committee to make sure that this independent person, Cartier, and you see the name right here above, that he actually got to the material questions that we all are hoping can have answers to satisfy clean athletes that why the rules weren't followed and that in fact this was some sort of contamination and not intentional use. And so I'm going to walk through this report very briefly and the annex, which has a lot of interesting facts and raises a lot of interesting questions. I put this in the science section, equally could have gone into other sections, but please take a look at it if you haven't seen it. And we could spend hours discussing it, but I think at the start, there were really 2 questions that were asked, and these are somewhat paraphrased, but I tried to use the key language, but you can look at the questions yourself. But basically, was there any indication of bias towards China and WADA's assessment of the decision by CHINATA not to bring these cases forward? Now, WADA has acknowledged in forums that CHINATA did not follow the rules. As I talked previously in the legal section, they should have found a violation, they should have disqualified, and they should have made these publicly announced. And look, if the transparency rule would have been followed, we're not having this conversation. The problem is that for whatever reason, these were swept under the carpet and the rules weren't followed. And we are now asking those questions, and we're starting to see there's serious questions about, were these really contamination? And why wasn't it given the standard 4-year sanction that possibly should have been given? So that's the first question. And then the second question is, based on the case file and other elements that WADA had at its disposal, was WADA's decision not to challenge the contamination scenario a reasonable one? And again, we just think these two questions are entirely too narrow and don't get to the heart of the real issue. A couple big points about them. I think the first question, there's a legal term, it's Latin, called res ipsa loquitur. The thing speaks for itself. Look, China received special treatment under the rules. Like, the bias was towards China because the rules didn't apply to China. China, as WADA has acknowledged, didn't apply the rules. So of course they were biased towards China. It's so obvious. But, you know, of course, his answer was a different answer. But it seems to be pretty obvious that when the rules aren't applied to certain athletes in certain countries, like WADA failed to do in China, and yet in other countries, they do apply the rules and make it public and make them prove source before finding contamination, make them prove the causation of the source before finding contamination, that they got favorable treatment. So it's hard to understand really at that level how they came out to something different. I'll also say a little bit more specifically, under Article 7.1 of the WADA Code, WADA's talked about they had 100% chance of losing, 0% chance of winning the cases if they appealed the cases. And I think they're really talking about the contamination piece because as I've said already, clearly, 100% they win that a violation committed, that disqualification should have happened, and they should have been made public. 100%. There's no chance they would have lost that because there is not the ability under the rules, there is no authority to be able to do what China did in these cases. But I'd also say WADA had another option that's clearly in the rules, is WADA has the authority to basically direct or order an organization that has results management authority on cases to fulfill the results management process. And then you can read the rule. And if that organization doesn't do it, they're found non-compliant, and they have to pay the costs of whatever it would have cost for someone else to bring the case. WADA failed to do that for some reason. And it's clear the athletes were never notified. They didn't bring these to a hearing. The results management process, as the rules require, didn't happen. And yet WADA didn't direct or order as they have the authority to do. So Cartier didn't ask that question. He didn't ask, was it reasonable that they didn't do this? I think clean athletes would say it wasn't reasonable at all not to do that, is what I think would have been the answer. Number two, no appeal of the cases for failure to follow the rules. And again, it absolutely was reasonable to appeal cases where the National Anti-Doping Organization, USADA, didn't have authority to do what they did. And WADA, we now know, has admitted that they didn't follow the rules. And it certainly would have been reasonable for them to follow the rules. And then thirdly, there was no compliance action. So when a National Anti-Doping Organization, and our staff, we all know this, we've gone through an in-person compliance audit in the last, end of 2022. And we know when they come in, they look at everything you've done and every letter that you've sent and make sure that you follow the letter of the law in every case and every sample has to abide by the rules and the procedures. And if you don't do that, they bring a compliance case against you. We all remember the time and effort we put in to that compliance audit. They didn't do that on USADA. Yet they knew USADA didn't follow the rules, and yet they didn't use the tools that they had, and that was not reasonable either. The real question that should have been asked, and a proper investigation into the handling of this case and these cases should have been, did WADA do everything they should have done under the rules to ensure that clean athletes' rights were upheld? And it just is clear they didn't. So looking at the annex, of the Cartier report and remembering what I said earlier about the contamination theory of WADA, the fluctuations, a couple points I want to make. Number one, this is paragraph 33 of the Cartier Annex. So again, this is WADA's self-review. They interviewed some people. This was interviews with the science department at WADA. And they had uncertainties about the source of contamination. That's Cartier based on interviews. Now remember, that's totally different than what the media statement said, right, that I showed you. Exclusively was the word pointed to. Well, actually, at the time and during the Cartier review over the last couple months, the science folks didn't agree with that. They also said the lack of TMZ measurements in a foodstuff, and I'm going to talk a little bit about this in just a second. But the claim was that TMZ was found in the kitchen, in sauce containers, and in the kitchen hub, and maybe in the sludge. We don't know exactly, and it's a little bit vague in the Cartier report, but contrast that with what they told Congress. It was in the kitchen hub and the sludge and sauce containers. But because they didn't know the measurements in that stuff, it was almost impossible to design a realistic scenario of how this could have ended up in the urine. Remember that causation. You have to show that the source actually caused the level of the positive for it to be a no-fault contamination case. So the best that the science team could do, and again, this is all in paragraph 33, and I've taken out some of the language that isn't directly relevant, but read the whole piece, please. The results of the calculations attempted to determine how much contamination would you need to cause the 1 to 1.7 nanogram finding in the urine. Makes sense, right? Like if you eat a bunch of food that's contaminated, how much do you need to eat in order to produce 1 to 1.7 nanograms in your urine? So they came to the conclusion a few micrograms. So just keep those thoughts in your head for a second. They also went on to say that this was not sufficiently precise to confirm or exclude contamination. Again, this is the language that Cartier, after interviewing science team at WADA, put in his report. Highly different than what we've seen so far. They persisted in finding that a few micrograms was high for contamination and was surprised that the Chinese had not found someone actually taking TMZ in the kitchen, because that few micrograms is a high amount. We're going to talk about that in just a second. So a couple other questions that come about from the Cartier Annex. First, we know date-wise, June 15th, 2021, China sent the files of the 28 positive tests, but the 23 athletes, 13 of whom ended up being on the Olympic team in 2021, 11 of whom who had positive TMZ tests end up being on the 2024, the most recent Olympic Games that just concluded. They send the file on June 15th, 2021. Well, the very next day, the WADA Director General has a phone call with the Chinese Minister of Sport, who also sits on the WADA Foundation Board. And according to the Cartier report, these cases come up. It's part of a conversation, but the cases come up. And it's awfully interesting that the head of WADA is having a conversation about these cases with someone that sits on the WADA Foundation Board. On July 8th, and you've heard WADA talk about an outside legal opinion that was given. On July 8th, they get an outside legal opinion not to appeal because they couldn't disprove the contamination theory, was essentially of what they said. Well, days after that, they get the initial science information provided internally within WADA. So, it's really interesting that the outside legal counsel a week before, roughly, says don't appeal, but yet they didn't have the initial science information. So how can you base a recommendation not to appeal when you don't have all the science information? Number two, FINA actually appeals the case on July 15th. And what's interesting is FINA had their expert report prior to their decision to appeal. They also had the WADA legal report prior to them appealing. But they decided to go ahead and appeal to CAS. And really interesting, WADA has told its foundation board that the two, and the media and the public, that FINA, which is now World Aquatics, but FINA at the time and WADA were acting independently, and they came to the same conclusion separately. But the Cartier report shows that's just not right. They were working very, very closely together. In fact, they were talking about division of labor, was the quote in the Cartier report, to determine who was going to take what aspects of the case. But FINA actually appealed. They asked CAS to keep it confidential pending what WADA was going to do. So on July 19th, remember how I said keep that few micrograms in your head? We're going to talk a little bit about that for a second. So the best that WADA science team could get was it would take a few micrograms to be contaminated, to equal the levels in the athlete's sample. So they ask, in the annex, the WADA legal team asks China in writing, as it reads, how much contamination was in the sauce containers and the kitchen. And what they said was there was a range. This is China's response back to WADA. Back in June, July, well, July 19th is when the response came back in. So there was 0.03 nanograms per milliliter up to 0.2 nanograms per milliliter in the sauce containers and in the kitchen, is what the Cartier report says. And so that's 0.2 is the maximum, okay, nanograms per milliliter, the maximum amount. I'm just going to focus on the maximum amount, okay? If it was less chance, but let's just focus on the maximum amount that they reported. And importantly, that's milliliters, nanograms per milliliter. So it's measuring it in a liquid, not a solid, but a liquid. This actually may be a typo. You know, our science folks think it's probably a typo because it's tough to measure something off of sauce can or a kitchen hub in a liquid form. So it's hard to know. And there was one typo that was noted after the Cartier report was published. They made a footnote that it had changed. I don't know. We don't know, but we're going to analyze it under both just to be sure. So here, if it is nanograms per milliliter, okay, so think about it. It's a liquid, and 0.2 nanograms of that milliliter are contaminated. So the question becomes, in order to get a few micrograms, which again is the amount that WADA has said you would have to take to result in the positive test, how much of that liquid would you have to actually intake? Well, 2 nanograms per milliliter, in order to get 1 microgram, you'd have to have 5,000 milliliters that are contaminated, which is 5 liters, which is 1.3 gallons. So you'd have to have 1.3 gallons of a contaminated liquid to equal 1 microgram. That's 1 microgram. WADA Science said a few micrograms. So again, just so we're clear, and look, we ran this by our science people this morning. I'm not the scientist either, but this is understandable. And it makes no sense that these athletes had 1.3 gallons of contaminated liquid. It's hard to imagine. So our science folks actually think this should be 0.03 nanograms per gram. So again, that's a solid, not a liquid, but a solid. And so if it's contaminated, the solid, whether, if it's the sludge or the sauce or the sauce containers, but let's say it's a solid that's actually contaminated at 0.2 nanograms per gram. Again, we're taking the maximum level. Similarly, it would take 5,000 grams of that contaminated solid, which is 5 kilograms, which is 11 pounds. So you'd have to eat 11 pounds of whatever solid food was contaminated with the TMZ to equal the 1 or a few, it's actually 1, it's the lowest level, the 1 microgram. It's incredible to believe. Interestingly, after WADA ran, assumably these kind of figures, they went back to China for clarification. And it's hard to tell in the Cartier report, but China then says no trace TMZ inside the containers nor the food itself. So they kind of backed off, it seems. Again, these are legit questions we have, but if you read the report, and we've read it very, very closely, it seems to be that they backed off of this. And they said, oh, well, that happened 2.5 months ago. We don't know what the levels actually were. And they came off of, and obviously they came off of it, I would suspect, because it just doesn't add up that this contamination scenario happened. And remember what I said during the legal part, causation. There have been past cases where if the athlete can't prove the actual amount of contamination found resulted in the amount in the sample, you don't prove source for purposes of finding of no fault. So then WADA's science opinion comes in, that's July 30, 31. And there were 2 different, the chief science officer and the director of science, who both, and I showed you the language previously where they had uncertainties. They couldn't rule in or out contamination. That was their decision. However, they internally, WADA lawyer sent a note, internal lawyer sent a note around to the staff saying we've closed the case. That's the gist of the case. So last section, what did the investigation say? Because there's a lot of questions. Did the athletes actually stay together? Were they in the same hotel? Were they training prior together? Were there other athletes who stayed in that same hotel that tested negative? Did they look at the follow-up, the samples? Did they do B samples? Did they look at lab documentation? Did they investigate this in the way that anti-doping organizations are required to investigate? They did a science review. We know that. They've said that. We've seen a little bit of that in the Cartier report. So did they do an investigation? And this might be the part that's most troubling about this case, because we sent whistleblower tips in March of 2020 to WADA's investigative and intelligence team. We sent more in September of 2020. The ITA, the International Testing Agency, also provided tips to WADA's I&I team. We know that because WADA has acknowledged that. We haven't seen what those tips are. And then we sent a further tip in April of 2023. And the gist of what we provided was the fact that Chinese swimmers and the Chinese National Swim Association was doing 2 things. 1, hiding positive tests, but then also keeping their athletes away from testing to avoid positive tests. And that is an important fact, we think, that correlates to the testing that we've been asking for in that December time period, where at least one media outlet has reported those swimmers had way less testing in the month of December, leading into this event at which they tested positive. And so we've asked for the dates of the testing on those athletes to be published to give us comfort that no, this actually is a case of contamination, not of intentional use. But certainly the tips we got named specific athletes that ended up having positive tests, talked about hiding them from testing, seems to correlate and be directly corroborative of this idea that this is not contamination, but it's actually intentional use. What's even more disturbing is that this is a report from the head of the intelligence department at WADA. And if you look at the date, it's May 15th, 2020. So think about time-wise. This was presented, as we understand it, to the WADA Executive Committee. It's a written report that's now been publicized that they informed the Executive Committee that they actually did an investigation where there was a defector from China, a doctor, who had, information about systemic doping within the sports community. And that they interviewed Dr. Zhu, I think is how you pronounce it. And they considered her to be a credible witness. This is a direct quote from that report. Again, that was presented on May of 2020, just a few months before this event. And less than 9 months before WADA got first notice of 23 positive tests for TMZ. They also said that some of the allegations that this credible witness, Dr. Zhu, who they met with in Germany and interviewed and turned into this report, some of the allegations were referring to allegedly undetectable levels of prohibited substances, namely trimetaziodine and stanozolol and growth hormones. So less than 9 months before they then get 28 positives on 23 athletes for low levels of trimetaziodine, they had just closed an investigation into a whistleblower that they found to be credible, who told them this is exactly what the Chinese swimmers and athletes are doing in order to dope. And they even went so far to say that should they receive new information or evidence be presented, we will reopen the case. But what we know, unfortunately, is they didn't do, whether based on this, or based this report, this investigation, or based on the tips that we sent them, what we know is that when those 23 positives came in for TMZ, that they didn't open an investigation. They've acknowledged, they did a science review, maybe call it a science investigation, but their investigators did not do any factual investigation into what actually might have been going on. So in fact, WADA, when these 28 positive samples, again on the 23 athletes came in, WADA actually didn't open up a new investigation. And here's what they said, is one, that they looked into these files, and I think they're referring to the tips that us and the ITA provided them when they said this, and that they logged those tips in their system, which is great. They did advise, after hearing from science and legal, from what they say, and I think these comments are from their press conference in April of this year, I think it was April 22nd, that they did advise that there was no impetus to investigate. It's hard to know if they actually got provided all of the files on the TMZ 23 when they actually came in, or if this was after the fact. But they said they didn't investigate, there was no impetus to investigate because there was no evidence or compelling evidence or intelligence was presented. So again, I think they're referring to just the tips that they got from us and from the ITA when they decided there was no impetus to investigate. It's unclear whether they got the full dossier of the 23 positive tests. And so what did Cartier say about it? Well, unfortunately in Cartier, there's not one mention of the WADA I&I team being involved with the timeline that I showed you or any of the factual or scientific investigation. Doesn't seem that they were involved at all. And that's incredible to believe, actually, based on the whistleblower, based on our tips and the ITA's tips, based on 23, what more evidence do you need when you have 23 positive tests for the very substance that a credible whistleblower a few months earlier told you was being used by Chinese athletes in order to gain a performance-enhancing advantage? So where are we now? That's sort of the facts, some of the rules, some of the science. So where are we now? Clearly, the world needs answers. Clean athletes demand and want answers and deserve answers. The public who are asking these same questions deserve answers. From our standpoint, there's a few key points. Number one, we still have to get justice in the individual cases. You know, athletes, both the Chinese athletes who never got the benefit of due process, they deserve to have the results management process take place so that the world can know for sure whether or not this was legit contamination or was it something else. And that's why we're asking for justice in the individual cases to be done. And of course, athletes that competed against those athletes deserve to know, should they have had a 4-year suspension and been kept out of major international competitions since that time period? Or was the no-fault finding the right finding? And that question by other athletes who swam against these swimmers just as recently as the 2024 Paris Olympic Games, as well as the 2021 Olympic Games, as well as World Championships and international competitions in between. That question, if unanswered, very well may haunt these athletes who swam against them for the rest of their life. And that's not fair. That's not what the system should be doing. And the statute of limitation, the legal ability to bring the cases has not expired. WADA could direct, we think still, under that provision, Article 7.1, direct, because the results management process has never happened. They could direct them to be brought, and if USADA doesn't bring them, they can be brought by someone else with jurisdiction and authority to bring them. Accountability has to happen. We have to know why it took, whistleblowers, assumably giving information to the media for this to come out, and for the world, unfortunately, in the way that it did, find out about these positive tests and the fact that China swept these cases under the carpet and they weren't handled according to what the rules were. And then of course, we need reform. So a little bit more detail. We've asked for an independent investigator and prosecutor to prosecute the cases. We've also asked for the disclosure of the file, including a lot of the science data and all the science data that we've talked about a little bit here today. And in part, if WADA truly believes that contamination of TMZ can happen like it happened in this case, well, they should be sending an advisory out and a warning out. They never did that. Are other athletes putting themselves in similar situations? If WADA truly believed that, you would think they would take the step. That's what they've done in other scenarios. That's, of course, what many NADOs, National Anti-Doping Organizations, do. We do it. So we give those warnings. Stay away from supplements. But we've heard nothing about TMZ, and we haven't seen the data to answer the questions that need to be answered. We now know, after this broke, it's been reported in the media, there are more cases out of China where WADA failed to follow the rules, failed to require the Chinese Anti-Doping Agency to follow the rules. 2 more were announced on a swimmer that was in the 2024 Games for a powerful steroid, methionine, or what's known as D-ball, that similarly was blamed on some food. But the cases weren't announced. There was no disqualification. There was no violation. And we need to know how many more are there of these, because those cases are getting special consideration and treatment under the rules. And athletes from other countries, listen, we have contamination cases. We know that they can exist. We go through the proof, scientifically, factually, to prove the source, to prove the causation. And when that happens, we announce it and we publicize. And maybe we give a no-fault finding if it is deserved under the facts and the science of those particular cases. So we know those happen. The problem here is these have all been swept under the carpet and the rules haven't been applied. And so the world doesn't know. There's not accountability on the actual decision-making on those cases. And that's not allowed under the rules. So even if it was contamination in these cases, how many more are there? WADA's made reference to there's many more. How many more athletes and countries are getting special treatment by the rules? And what are we going to do about ensuring that there's not 2 sets of rules, some for the chosen few and some for the rest of the world that are actually applying the rules as the rules are required to be applied? And then lastly, reform has to occur. And you'll see in the World Aquatics Audit Compliance Report that was done, they set up a panel to review it. They have a list of 10 or so recommendations that are fine and are good. But I think what's really important is that we don't know all the reform that's going to be necessary until we can find out actually how this happened and why this happened. We can create another 2,000 pages of rules. I think the WADA code system in its entirety is about 2,600 and something pages. The WADA code, the international standards, models of best practice, the laboratory standards. It's an incredible amount of legislation and regulation. We can create another, but 2,600 pages. But that's not going to get to the decision making and the answers of how this actually happened. And we think, and we've heard from athletes on this, that's what's really important to happen first before deciding on what the reform looks like. Because in a vacuum, you can't answer what the proper reform is going to be. Yeah, there's ideas out there, and yeah, we can come up with a list of those, and we all should. But we ought to get to prosecuting the cases first, and we ought to get to how and why this happened, the accountability point, before we get to what the reform ultimately might look like. All right, with that, I'm going to take some questions here. And of course, for anybody still with us on the video, you can see my email as well as our Play Clean, our tip line, if you want to send a question anonymously. But feel free also, you've got my email. Happy to answer any questions we can. And as I said at the very beginning, it matters because clean athletes deserve better, frankly, from the system. And we're hoping that we can get to the bottom of what happened and put in place the accountability as well as processes going forward to ensure that something like this doesn't happen. And so the rights of the Chinese athletes get their due process. Athletes who lost to them are protected, and those athletes that those with positive tests from China may have competed against, their rights are upheld as well.
I really appreciate it, Travis. Great information. I just wondered why, or if you could speak a little bit more about why the FINA case didn't go forward. You had mentioned that it had been appealed by FINA.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I should have mentioned. So FINA appealed the case. A few days later, I think it was maybe the 15th, they appealed it of July, and then I think it was the 21st of July, they withdrew their appeal. There's no indication of what caused them to withdraw their appeal. What seems clear is that their appeal was filed after their science expert opinion, after the legal opinion, but there's no indication of what then occurred for them to withdraw the appeal. There's a note in the Cartier report that says the General Secretary of FINA, now World Aquatics, who just had come on the job at that time, he was new, he said that they based their decision to withdraw their appeal largely on their science report, which they had, interestingly, before they appealed. So it seems that as WADA was making its decision to appeal or not, they were in concert and discussion with FINA, and while FINA appealed, preserving the appeal deadline, they decided to withdraw it after WADA decided not to move forward with their appeal. But there's no specific indication of what came up in that interim that forced them or made the decision for them to withdraw their appeal. Yeah, so any more questions?
Yeah, I have one. Do we have any examples of this kind of substance in the food supply? Any other contamination cases that might be relatable to this?
Yeah, no, great question, and thanks for it. No, there's no evidence that this shows up in kitchens or is in the food supply. It's a controlled medication available by prescription in some countries, not available here in the U.S., for example. So no, there's no evidence that we're aware of outside of this case that it shows up anywhere other than in via a prescription medication.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Even though Cartier was an external lawyer, like he wasn't, he didn't work with WADA, hadn't he worked with WADA in the past? And so there's a possibility that his report is kind of tainted because he's not that external. He's an external source, but he's worked with WADA before.
Yeah. So I don't think he worked with WADA, but I think what's been reported is how WADA found him was that their auditor called WADA and said when this was first coming out and there were calls for an independent review to be done, that WADA's other auditor, who was friends with Mr. Cartier, called WADA and said, hey, if you're looking for someone, here is someone who used to be in the Swiss legal community and might be good to be able to do that. So I'm not sure Cartier himself did work for WADA, but it was a friend of someone who did do work for WADA. Yeah, I guess I'll just expand slightly on that. I mean, I think the Cartier, and let's assume he has all the integrity and is going to do the right thing if given the opportunity. The problem, I don't think was given the opportunity. You know, the two very narrow terms of the reference of the questions that we talked about were so narrowly focused. You know, it's very easy when you hire someone to just put what I call the blinders in the handcuffs, where they can't really look at what's happening around these two narrow. So let's assume he did everything in the right way on those two questions. It was just flawed from the start, in our opinion. It should have been a much broader conversation and investigation to really find out that, again, that broad question I asked, did WADA do everything they should have done? Clean athletes who go through everything that I described that they go through on a daily basis, they want the organizations that are supposed to have their back to go to those great lengths to protect their rights. If they're willing to go to those great lengths, why isn't the organization willing to go to those great lengths to make sure their rights are protected? And it seems clear that wasn't done in this case, based on what we know. And it's why we're asking for more. All right, other questions?
I have one.
Yeah, Brett.
So a couple questions for you. I guess first, was there any evidence provided of, I guess, the timeline of the athletes eating? Like, what meals did they eat at the hotel? When was their last meal, to provide any evidence of when they would be getting the last dose and looking at that?
Yeah, no, listen, it's one of those questions that we don't have answers to. What did they eat? How much did they eat? When did they eat? All those things. Maybe they're there in the file. We just don't know, and we haven't seen it. So it's in part why we're asking, for the file to be produced to see if this contamination conclusion that WADA seems to have made is actually, supported by the facts and the evidence.
Okay. And then second question, I guess, the Valieva case was, her defense was it was food contamination.
Yeah.
How is this different?
Yeah, I think same in that they were the same substance, low level, 2.1 is what we understand in her case. She claimed contamination. Different procedures and outcome, and WADA's handling was totally different. They appealed it to the Court of Arbitration for Sport. She ended up getting a 4-year sanction, even though she claimed also contamination. Now you have to look at the facts to see what are the real differences in the case, but the handling of those were starkly different from WADA's perspective, even though there were a lot of commonalities between them. All right, Allison.
So you mentioned swimmers earlier in the presentation, and we've heard from athletes and swimmers from around the world, and of course here in the U.S. What can you tell athletes right now in terms of next steps and what can be done now moving forward?
Yeah, no, well, Allison, thanks. And obviously, Olympian on our team runs our athlete engagement and international relations. So thanks for the question. And listen, I think you saw my slide about justice and trying to prosecute the cases. It's the statute of limitation, which is 10 years, has not expired. And we're asking and advocating for an independent prosecutor that has an investigative group. It has to be separate from WADA, because at this point, WADA is, wed to this contamination theory, despite all the questions that exist around it. So it has to be outside of that. But we're asking the WADA Executive Committee to engage an independent investigator and prosecutor and actually get the case file, do the factual, interview the athletes, look at past test results, determine whether they stayed at the same hotel, all the things that we've talked about, and then bring those cases so that we can get before the Court of Arbitration for Sport, and so that the world can have confidence that these cases have been handled the right way, and that justice, whatever that is, if the athletes ultimately get a no-fault case because of legitimate contamination, that is what it is, or is there another sanction that should be put in place? And look, I think this is maybe the most important question, because that's the question that will, as I said earlier, will haunt athletes potentially for the rest of their lives. What opportunity was taken away from me? And it will remove any dark cloud from the Chinese athletes. And it's terribly unfair that those athletes had to show up in Paris with this dark cloud hanging over their head. And that's due to the fact that the rules weren't followed. If the rules would have been followed and they would have been announced and everyone would have agreed it was no fault contamination, that dark cloud wouldn't have existed. People may have debated it, but it wouldn't have been near as tragic for those athletes as it turned out to be in the Paris Olympic Games. As far as going forward, and I think this is a really important question, athletes have to keep doing the right thing. And we would beg you, yes, we understand how easy it is to get frustrated by this situation and want to just throw in the towel and say, forget this whole anti-doping thing, it's not working. But please don't do that. That's not the right outcome. The right outcome is to engage. Use your voice, use the power that you have to help us and others, both our governments from around the world, national anti-doping organizations from around the world, the sport organizations from around the world, to ensure that this system best protects clean athletes' rights and doesn't allow certain athletes from certain countries to get the special treatment that we saw in these cases. And so there's a number of ways. Get in contact with us if you're interested. A number of ways you can advocate and actually engage to get the type of program and reform to the system that we need to ensure that your rights are ultimately upheld. The alternative is not the answer. You can't just throw in the towel, and we can't just throw in the towel. And it's exactly why, on behalf of you as a clean athlete, and you as an Olympic swimmer, Allison, know this, we're pushing hard to get the system as good as it can be to ensure that athletes have an opportunity to win the right way and win the clean way. So thanks. All right, well, listen, thanks everybody. I think we're gonna have lunch here. I wanna thank everybody at home for joining us through the video as well. And look, the idea here was just, given how much there's been written about this topic, given, as I talked about at the beginning, how important this is, we know it's tough to read everything. And our team here has been doing the job to try to follow it all, because we know how important it is to our athletes. And we're getting calls and questions, literally daily from our athletes about this scenario and what can be done and how are we going to move this forward for the good of their rights to compete on a level playing field. And so we were hopeful that this brief conversation, and I'm not necessarily trying this case in this presentation at a court, certainly not the scientific expert. I've obviously consulted with all of them, but we thought it would be just an opportunity to kind of have a conversation, go through the facts, see the outstanding questions and some of the reasoning that has gotten us to this point, and also, most importantly, see where we need to go to restore the confidence in the global anti-doping system that athletes deserve and actually are demanding us to be able to do. So thanks for watching, and hope to see you somewhere around the US or around the world. So thank you.